In memory-focused trauma therapies, including EMDR and imagery interventions, how can a clinician distinguish a therapeutic modification of a memory from unintended memory distortions?
Wow. Yeah. Well, again, memory is not like a videotape machine, right? Like you're always going to have some type of distortion, so to speak. I mean, it's just the way the brain works. And so that's really a difficult thing. I mean, there's some people, some therapists, the French psychologist Pierre Janet, for example, he talked about actually altering traumatic memories in various ways, trying to change the memory to make it less traumatic. Janet said that it's hard to do. This is long before the exposure therapies, where Edna Foa, and they just keep going at her, Patty Reesick's CPT. A memory changes, right? So even so, there's how does that differ from distortion? Distortion, if it in fact is a factually incorrect memory, I thought they were assaulted by two people and it was only one person, there's clearly a distortion. But a therapeutic change is likely going to be one of two things. One is that the meaning of the memory may differ, right? And so, like I was mentioning with the kids who'd been molested, who thought that they were somehow to blame for this, right? And so it was something that was a guilt-inducing kind of a thing. And so changing the appraisal or the meaning of that is relevant. Of course, is the main issue where the memory is less emotionally evocative. They can think about it without reliving it. Right. So those are the two ways that changing it therapeutically would be different from simply a distortion.
Everyone, and welcome, Professor McNally. It's a great pleasure and honor to welcome you in our program, Ruh Sağlığı Azerbaijan. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation and for taking the time to be with us today. Before we begin, I would like to briefly introduce you to our audience. Actually, everyone I think know about you, but I need to introduce a little bit about you. Professor McNally is a professor of psychology at Harvard University, where he has been a faculty member since 1991 and full professor since 1995. He has also served as Director of Clinical Training in Harvard Department of Psychology since 2003 years. He received his PhD in Clinical Psychology from the University of Illinois at Chicago and completed his clinical psychology internship at the Behavior Therapy Unit at Temple University School of Medicine. His work has profoundly influenced our scientific understanding of anxiety disorder, PTSD, traumatic memory recovered as false memories. I loved it. And the cognitive mechanism involved in psychopathology. Importantly, Professor McNally was directly involved in the DSM-4 post-traumatic stress disorder subgroup and later served as DSM-5 stress-induced and fair circuitry disorder work group and as an advisor to the DSM-5 anxiety disorder sub work group. His book, Remembering Trauma, received an honorable mention from the Association of American Publishers Professional Scholarly Publishing Annual Award in Psychology. He has also been recognized as highly cited author in psychology and psychiatry and received the Distinguished Scientist Award from the Society for Science of Clinical Psychology and the Outstanding Mentor Award from the Association for Behavioral and Cognitive Therapies. His contribution to the experimental study of traumatic memory spanned decades, including research on cognitive processing in PTSD, autobiographical memory, childhood sexual abuse, recovering memory, false recognition, and memory distortions. Professor McNally, once again, thank you for joining us. It's a privilege to have you here. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Gumru. Thank you very much. Can you hear my voice okay?
Yeah, everything.
Oh, okay, good.
Yeah.
Yes, we've had quite an adventure trying to get this thing running here. Running a few minutes behind, but okay. Yes, when I was chatting with you back in I think it was late spring, we were talking about a topic that I might present out of a lot of possible topics, but the whole issue about repressing memories of trauma. Can we actually block them out, render them inaccessible? So what I wanted to do is to focus in on this topic, to go over some of the controversies and some of the relevant evidence bearing on this question, and then open it up. I think we have time for some questions as well at the end. Okay, so So this is what the people who claim that we can repress memories of trauma, right? That is, it's not a matter of people on both sides of this debate. Can you repress or dissociate memories of trauma? One being evidence-based and the other not. That's not true. Actually, in fact, the advocates for the claim that we can block out memories of trauma is the folks who do hold that belief, they certainly adduce evidence. They cite studies that are relevant to this. But I think what often happens, though, is that the studies are sometimes misinterpreted. So, for example, these three fellows here, Dan Brown, Alan Shefflin, and Corey Hammond, wrote an award-winning book, actually, Memory, Trauma, Treatment, and the Law. And it's a very big, thick book, and in which Brown et al. Claim that there's, quote, overwhelming scientific support for the existence of repressed or dissociated memory. You can see how big the book is by the page numbers in which that quote is drawn, 538. But some of these fellows and others who are also in this line of thinking, like Bessel van der Kolk, Judy Herman, and some of those folks, these traumatic amnesia theorists often misinterpret the very studies they cite in support of the phenomenon. Right? And so what I want to do is to show how some of these confusions have arisen in citing typical studies that are fairly well known to the people in the PTSD field, and how they sometimes have mistaken them as confirming that people can block out, dissociate, or repress memories of trauma. So the first confusion is confusing everyday forgetfulness with traumatic amnesia. Yep. So, for example, this is an old study done in 1983 in the American Journal of Psychiatry by Charles Wilkinson. Wilkinson was actually a private practice psychiatrist in Kansas City, Missouri. And what happened is in Kansas City, there was a Hyatt Regency Skywalk collapse. And so the Hyatt Regency hotels in America, these really, really tall buildings, and they have a sort of a lobby that goes all the way up to the ceiling, maybe 80 stories up, very, very high. And they're sort of a circle, okay, they're sort of a circle. And they have these skywalks, like concrete sidewalks that go across on the different levels. So you don't have to walk all the way around the hotel, for example. Shortcuts. Well, what happened here in this hotel is there was a big dance party going on in the lobby. So there's a lot of people dancing, and there's music, and they've got food there. And suddenly, this poorly installed skywalk breaks free, and this huge, long piece of concrete goes falling right down people who are dancing. And it was a horrific scene. I've seen pictures of this, and my God, you got people dead and injured and blood all over the place. It's a terrible scene. And so what Wilkinson did is that he then did clinical assessments. This is under the DSM-3, okay, at the time, assessing for post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms in what they call the first responders. So these are the ambulance workers and firefighters, police, etc., who are coming in to this terrible scene to try to rescue these people. Now, what Wilkinson found, sorry? Oh, was there a question? I'm sorry. Oh, okay. So what he found is that 27% of the people reported memory difficulties. And so Dan Brown and some of these fellows say, aha, here's a situation, this traumatic event, and people can't remember it. The problem, however, is that in the DSM-3, the symptom memory difficulties was referring to memory impairment or trouble concentrating overall. And it's not that they can't remember the trauma, but because they remember the trauma so well, in fact, were having repeated recollections and images of this gruesome scene, that because of the intrusive memories, they have a hard time remembering everyday things. That's what memory difficulties mean here in DSM-3. So, for example, someone might say, oh, okay, I'm going to go to the store to get some certain groceries, and you get to the store and you forget what you're going to buy. Or you forget to send a close friend a birthday card. Things that was everyday problems with memory difficulties. It wasn't an inability to remember the trauma. That's a real serious confusion. Another one. So basically, post-traumatic memory impairment refers to everyday forgetfulness that develops after the trauma. It does not mean an inability to remember the trauma itself. Okay, so this is a mistake that you sometimes see when folks are trying to find evidence for dissociative traumatic amnesia, repression. Another confusion, which is a little more understandable, is confusing psychogenic amnesia with traumatic amnesia. Now, what makes things complicated is that sometimes these two terms are used interchangeably, but the phenomenon of psychogenic amnesia is very, very rare. It's a very rare syndrome. And what happens in these cases is that a person has sudden massive memory loss, including loss of personal identity. So the persons, they say, who am I? Where am I doing? What am I doing here? They can't remember anything from their past. And there's no apparent physical insult to the brain. So some of these cases have been, they look at MRI and they're looking for strokes, and there's no obvious evidence for that. And that's why it gets called psychogenic. Occasionally, sometimes there's some stressor that has preceded it, but it's seldom a traumatic stressor. Right? So, for example, someone might be having marital difficulties, and then they wake up and suddenly don't know who they are or anything of this sort. And usually it lasts for hours, days, or weeks, and then suddenly the memories come back. It's a very peculiar phenomenon. And so they get this sudden remission. Now, one of my colleagues, Dan Schachter, who's probably the world's leading authority in cognitive psychology on memory, he studied one case. To give you an example about this couple, this young couple, they had just gotten married, and they were going to the airport to go fly off on their honeymoon. And they're checking into the airport, and all of a sudden, the person at the desk asks for their ID, their passport, and so forth. And he goes, "Oh my God, I left it in the car in the parking lot, in the parking structure." And so the husband says, "Okay, you wait right here. I'll be right back." They still had some time, the plane wasn't leaving right away. And he goes off to get his passport so he could board the plane, and he doesn't return. This disappears. And then suddenly, as I recall, this was in Texas, and suddenly they find this man who doesn't know who he is wandering around in some city in Minnesota. A very strange case. He just didn't lost. So it's a very mysterious phenomenon, but it's also very rare. The distinction between psychogenic amnesia, where you lose all of this memory and then you get it back, is that it's not specific to traumatic events. It's a different type of phenomenon. So it shouldn't be confused with inability to remember a specific trauma. Another confusion that sometimes comes up is confusing incomplete encoding of a memory with the inability to remember traumatic amnesia. So, for example, we have in DSM-4 and 5, there's an inability to recall an important aspect of the trauma. Okay, but the meaning of this symptom is somewhat ambiguous. What I mean by that is that the mind is not a video recorder, right? So, a lot of times people, they sort of have an image of memory as you're sort of videotaping something, and then when you recall some episode in your mind, you sort of replay the videotape. But when you remember an event from your past, you are accessing this event, and it's actually reassembled, so to speak, in working memory from elements distributed throughout the brain. So it's not a video recorder. It doesn't have perfect fidelity, right? And so if there's some aspect of a traumatic event that you don't remember, that may or may not be repression, right? It's some trivial sorts of things. So not every aspect of a traumatic experience will get encoded into memory in the first place, okay? So for example, there was a famous case a number of years ago in the United States when a fellow was being nominated for the Supreme Court, and there was a woman who came forward and said that he had tried to sexually assault her at one point in time. I'm not going to go off into that whole story and controversy, but when asked by people who were assessing this thing, well, what day did that happen? Do you remember the address at the home where this happened? She didn't remember those details. She remembered the details of this encounter that scared her at the expense of the other details, okay? So not every aspect of a traumatic experience will get encoded into memory in the first place. So if you don't remember everything about the event, it should not be confused with an inability to remember. You may not have actually encoded it, right? Because you're paying attention to something else. You're focusing in on the central aspects of the phenomenon. And for example, you see this a lot in law enforcement, right? So people robbed at gunpoint sometimes fail to encode the face of their assailant. That's sometimes called weapon focus. So for example, a friend of mine in Detroit many years ago, he was working at one of these all-night, like 7-Eleven type stores, and this guy comes in and pulls a gun out and sticks the gun right at him and says, "Open the safe." This is a robbery, right? And so my friend, he gets down, there's at 2 a.m, this guy's got this gun in his head, and he remembers the combination of the safe, opened it up, and the robber took off with the money and did not shoot him, which was good. But when it came to giving this description of the guy, he remembered the gun, but he didn't encode the face of the assailant. It wasn't masked, but he was so focused in on the weapon and then on the safe that he didn't encode it. Now this is, what happens with attention as a traumatic event is unfolding, the person tends to focus in on the most important, the most salient, usually the most threatening aspect of it, hence weapon focus. And that's often since our attentional focus is limited, right? So if you focus in on one thing, the stuff on the periphery, like the assailant's face, did he have glasses, did he have a mustache, etc., the person doesn't know, not because they repressed it, but because they never encoded it. Important distinction. So a later inability to recall the assailant's face would not constitute amnesia because the victim never encoded it in the first place. It's just not there to recall. Another confusion that sometimes comes up, and this is confusing non-disclosure with traumatic amnesia. By that I mean, if someone who has a history of, say, physical abuse or sexual abuse, and the person is now an adult, those events happen when they were a teenager or an 11-year-old kid or what have you, sometimes when they are asked questions, well, you ever traumatized or did any of these things happen, they may not want to disclose it. So for example, there's a couple of famous studies that were done by Kathy Whittam, who's a psychologist, but has done a lot of survey research on trauma. And she did these big surveys of Americans for whom she knew had abuse histories, either physical abuse, sexual abuse. In other words, the subjects in the study, they were from a larger database, and so the researchers knew who actually had been taken to the hospital and assessed for abuse or reported to the police, et cetera, when they're much younger. Okay, and then the people doing the surveys didn't know which one was an abuse victim or not. They're doing these surveys about the person's life, including questions about trauma. The investigators, Kathy Whittam, knew, but the interviewers did not. So here's what happened. A lot of these people actually said, when asked, were you ever physically abused or sexually abused as a child? And they'd think, well, no, I don't think so. No, that never happened to me. Next question. Now, in these cases, there's people who interpreted her work as, they must not have remembered it. They must have repressed the memories of it. Possibly, but a lot of times there was a follow-up survey that another group did, and then they actually talked to these adults, and they say, well, we have these records that you had been physically abused as a child. When asked by the surveyors whether that ever happened to you, you said no. And then they came back for this third time, right? Once as a child, twice as an adult. And they said, well, gee, there's some inconsistency, between this. And what they would say is a lot of times they say, okay, yeah, sure, I remembered my physical abuse by my dad. My dad had bipolar disorder. He would sometimes beat us. And then he got treatment. He's been on lithium for years, and he's doing just fine. I didn't want to talk about that stuff to this stranger. I didn't want to talk about that. So I said, no, it never happened. Failure to disclose or reluctance to disclose. And not that the person couldn't remember his father's violence towards him. He just didn't want to share it with with the interviewer. So it can be really tricky sometimes.
No.
Confusing childhood amnesia with traumatic amnesia. This is another common one. Linda Meyer Williams is a sociologist who did a big survey study with women for whom there was actually records that when they were little kids, little girls, their mom had taken them into the hospital for assessments because the mom was pretty sure that, in fact, the mother's boyfriend, for example, had actually been sexually fondling and molesting the little girl. And so there's hospital records of this, right? But now those little girls are younger women in their 20s and so forth. And Williams had these 129 women who had been assessed for childhood sexual abuse, CSA, 17 years earlier. Now they're young adults. And so they were asked, had you ever been sexually abused as a child? There's a lot of questions they're asking about their childhood. And 16 of these women, 12%, denied ever having been abused as a child. Never having been abused as a child at all. Now, this could be the non-disclosure. It could be repression or traumatic amnesia. It could be all of these options, right? So there's a number. But some of Williams's deniers were very young, though, when they were assessed for abuse. 3 and 4 years of age, if this abuse was not violent, it was somebody they knew, et cetera, the mother's boyfriend, and he's touching me in weird ways, and the mom gets upset. I go to the hospital. I talk to a doctor and a nurse, and that was the end of that. The boyfriend's kicked out of the house, and then the kid just kind of grows up, and it didn't register it very much. So, and this is true for most memories before the age 3 or 4 years old. So that this is called normal childhood amnesia. We're just beginning to have language, we're starting, and the brain is developing in such a way that most of us have very few memories from the age 2 to 4. It's very fragmented. So so these kids, it seemed to be unlikely cases that they had repressed the memories in this case. But the most important thing is that childhood amnesia, rather than traumatic amnesia, may be involved. That's an important one. I think one of the most common confusions that we see here on the phenomenology of remembering trauma is confusing not thinking about something for a long time with traumatic amnesia. And my team did a lot of research with people reporting recovered memories of abuse, and always thought of the memories, and continuous memories, and people who thought they had repressed memories, etc. But among the so-called recovered memory group, we had a lot of people who reported something like this. This was originally reported in a very large study by John Briere and John Conti. And what these two fellows did is they got consent to speak to 450 psychotherapy patients all over America that were working with clinical psychologists who were specializing in the treatment of adults who've been sexually abused as a child. So that's who he's surveying, right? And Briere and Conte, they got this big data set back together. There's a lot of different questions, but the interesting question here that was adduced as evidence for repressed memories of childhood sexual abuse, traumatic amnesia, was that 59% of the subjects responded affirmatively, yes, to the question, was there ever a time when you could not remember the forced sexual experience? Okay? And 59% says, yes, there was such a time. Okay? Now, what's weird about the way they phrase this question is an affirmative response implies unsuccessful retrieval attempts. In other words, was there a time in your past when you were trying to think about whether you were sexually abused or not, and you came up empty? No, I didn't have any, nothing came to mind. But if subjects were unaware of their abuse, on what basis would they attempt to recall it in the first place? So there's the way this question is formulated is really odd. So you have to have some evidence that you might have been abused for you to motivate a search to see whether I can remember anything like that. So for example, I know for a fact that back in 1956, on my second birthday, I had a candle, and I was wearing this little birthday hat, a little birthday gathering, and I'm blowing out 2 candles on the cake. Did I remember that from, that many years ago? Not directly, no, but I know it occurred. So I might have tried to think, gosh, can I remember that cake and that little birthday party when I was 2 years old? No, I can't. But the reason why that would motivate such a memory search is I've seen photographs, black and white photographs of me blowing out the candles on the cake. Now, in the case here, what would motivate the search in the first place? So the whole question is very odd. And so what I think, what I think is going on, what I think is going on with these folks, though, is that the question, the people are actually interpreting that question, is that, was there ever a period of time when you did not think about your abuse? That question makes sense, right? So you might have been sexually abused at the age of 10 or 11, and you didn't think about it for many years, and now you've got kids of your own or whatever, and you're in your 20s, and suddenly something reminds you of it, and you go, oh my God, I hadn't thought about that in ages, okay? And so that's a very different phenomenon. It's one that we saw a lot in our recovered memory subjects. More on that later. Finally, the last confusion that has been noted, and this one's less common, but Dan Brown and his colleagues in that famous book, they do mention this case here, but it's this confusing organic amnesia with traumatic amnesia. Now, what this term refers to is someone who has a physical insult to the brain that makes it very difficult to remember certain experiences typically associated with that event. And so, for example, here's a quote from the book, from Dan's book here. Dollinger is a clinical psychologist at Southern Illinois University, Carbondale, down in the southern part of the state. Dollinger found that 2 of the 38 children studied after watching lightning strike and kill a playmate had no memory of the event. Oh my gosh, what's this about? Well, Dollinger, what happened is that these are elementary school kids. They were playing, in the summertime, they're playing soccer, football to the rest of the world, the FIFA world. And So they're playing soccer in downstate Illinois, and one of these big Midwestern thunderstorms all of a sudden comes racing overhead, and thunder and a lightning bolt comes right down on the playing field and kills this kid. And his friends, his teammates, and the other team, they're watching this horrific event, the kid getting electrocuted right in front of their eyes. And what Dollinger did is that he then did clinical assessments. He was brought in here to assess these elementary school kids, 8, 9, 10-year-old kids, for post-traumatic stress disorder. And oh boy, yeah, and a lot of them had PTSD-like symptoms, plus other things. They're wetting the bed, they have nightmares, they want to sleep with their parents, are afraid of, all these things, didn't want to play soccer, things like that. And but there was a couple of kids here who had absolutely no memory for this. And Dollinger goes, aha, here's an event that indisputably occurred that these kids witnessed that is truly a traumatic event, watching a friend be electrocuted by the lightning bolt, and they had no memory. There's repression of a traumatic memory for you. However, Brown and all forgot to mention that both the amnesic kids in the study had themselves been hit by side flashes from the main lightning bolt. They were knocked unconscious and nearly killed. They medevaced them by helicopter across the Mississippi River to these trauma hospitals in St. Louis, Missouri, and the kids were saved. But they had no memory of the event. Yes, because the hard disk got erased partly. Okay, that's organic amnesia. It's not that they repressed the memory of the trauma. So, organic amnesia is not psychological traumatic amnesia. It's not repressed memory of that. Okay, our group, we've studied recovered memories of childhood sexual abuse here. And so here we have cases here of people who report having been sexually abused for some period of time, maybe just one event, maybe more of them, when they were young. Usually they were 7, 8 years old, and 6, 7, 8 years old in our study, roughly. And then they forgot about it, didn't think about it for many years, and then suddenly they remembered it again. So that's a memory of childhood sexual abuse. A recovered memory is not necessarily a previously repressed one, and is not necessarily a previously repressed traumatic memory, but it's something that happened to you, you encoded it, consolidated, you didn't think about it for a long time, and you encounter reminders, and suddenly you remember it again. Okay, that's the phenomenon here. And so in this particular study, we did a number of waves of research on this topic. And this one, we had 27 adults, mainly women, 17 of them women, 10 men. Their average age when they recovered the memories was 41. The average age at abuse, as I implied earlier, about 7.5 years old, 6, 7, 8 years old. And about 21 and a half years on average elapsed before recall. Okay, so they didn't think about it for a long period of time. Now, the mean abuse episodes was 1.7. So a lot of times it's just a single one, sometimes a few more, etc. But on average, there was not many of these. It was mainly fondling. Okay, so inappropriate touching of their genitals by an adult. And it did not involve pain or threat, and so it was nonviolent. In all of these cases, they knew who the perpetrator was: an older cousin, sometimes an older brother, an uncle, a grandfather, a neighbor, a gym teacher. So this is not a stranger. And so then we asked them, says, well, what triggered the recollection of this memory of sexual abuse? Now, we had 3 subjects said, well, I was just asked about it. Some of these subjects, for a variety of reasons, sometimes related to the abuse, it turned out, or other experiences, were in psychotherapy, and the assessment, the clinician is taking a personal history, and, well, did anything ever of a sexual sort that frightened you when you were a child? Were you touched or fondled by an adult, etc.? Just general memories about exposure to traumatic events. So 3 of them, when they were asked about that stuff, said, oh my God, I had forgotten about that. So they're asked. Just being in therapy in general, this doesn't necessarily mean there wasn't recovered memory therapy where people were saying, well, you've got bulimia, nervosa, or depression. This must mean that you repressed memories of childhood sexual abuse, and we're going to find those memories. So it wasn't that type of thing. It's just that when they're in therapy, they're thinking about their past and experiences, and suddenly, boom, they remember something like this. Alcoholics Anonymous, where they're meeting with a group and a circle of other people who are trying to stop drinking, and someone stands up, my name is John Smith, I'm an alcoholic, and I was also a sexual abuse survivor, and I'll tell my story. And so they would hear these things saying, oh my God, that happened to me too. A significant other's disclosure, somebody else had said that happened to me, and they, oh my God, it did to them. A friend's disclosure, just reflecting on childhood. Now, we also asked them, why do you think you forgot it? Now, about half of them said it was an unpleasant experience. It's not a classic trauma in the sense of they were terrified. It was unpleasant and so forth. and I just pushed it out of my mind. I just didn't want to think about it. Someone said, gee, I don't know. I just forgot. And 3 of those folks said, well, there were no reminders. Nothing actually prompted my recollection. Now, some of them, 3 of them said, I must have unconsciously repressed it, a defensive mechanism. These are people who maybe had taken Introduction to Psychology and learned about Freud and his ideas. And another 3 said, I have no idea. It just came to my mind. Now, a lot of them sought therapy, but for other types of problems, and some of these things actually popped up in therapy, as I mentioned. But only 3 sought therapy for the memories, only 1 to get memories. So they were, 25%, 93% described the CSA as unpleasant and distressing. Only 2 of them said it was traumatic, and only 2 remembered it even as sexual, but 16 knew it was wrong. So, I mean, if you're 7 years old and someone's touching here, and so, for example, these cases, they would say that, this is, we'll keep this between ourselves. Shh, okay, you touch me here, and I touch you there, and that's how I show how I love you, and that's how you show you love me, like an uncle or a grandfather or whatever. And the kid, they didn't even see it as sexual, really. They're 7 years old, right? And but they knew something was wrong. Like, why is he whispering? Why is he saying, "Shh, this is our secret"? We're not going to tell other people. Okay. So they know something's not. It's weird. A lot of these subjects, they said, I think all of them. I think there were multiple adverse effects from that. I don't trust men so much, or whatever. They had these general things. Occasionally, I have nightmares or whatever. And 30% of them met criteria for abuse-related PTSD. And so, what I mean here is when they had some reminder, and they thought of, say, their grandfather. For example, one case, they used to sit in their grandfather's lap and watch television together, and the grandfather would be hugging the little girl, etc., and he would touch her in her crotch, and then later, and then sometimes she would say, "Gosh, I feel something." I'm sitting in my grandpa's lap. I feel something wet under the back of my pants. He's obviously ejaculating, etc. But when you're a little kid, you don't know what the heck's going on. But they would remember this, and they go, "Oh my gosh, my grandfather, I can't believe that he betrayed me so much." They're having nightmares. They got abuse-related, so they call delayed onset PTSD, meeting all the criteria because they hadn't thought about this event, and when they remembered it, they interpreted it through the eyes of an adult, and bingo, they had all these symptoms. Now, so to summarize this part of it, there's been the notion of people having been sexually abused, for example, and then not having thought about it for a long time, and now they remember it. That is a very bare bones empirical description of the phenomenon. Now, there are explanations about why somebody would have that experience and then remember it later, right? So there's 3 different explanations for recovered memories of CSA. The first one is that the mind protects itself by banishing memories of abuse because they are so traumatic. That's it. So it's the trauma of it that drives the blockade of the memory. And the victim is unable to recall the memories until it's safe to do so later in life. And so this is the repression or the dissociation explanation. Something is so traumatic that suddenly this mental mechanism kicks in and segregates the memory and keeps the person from recalling it and being upset. David Spiegel, famous psychiatrist, Stanford University, this is a perfect, in his book, edited volume, entitled Repressed Memories, he says, quote, "The nature of traumatic dissociative amnesia is such that it is not subject to the same rules of ordinary forgetting. It is more, rather than less common, after repeated episodes, involves strong affect, and is resistant to retrieval through salient cues." Wow, that is different from the way a cognitive psychology says memory operates, because usually, you're talking about, he says, the more you get abused, the less likely you are to remember ever having been abused. Really? Obviously, if you've had a lot of different similar experiences, it may be difficult to remember individual ones. So, for example, someone who's flown on an airplane many times, all the memories tend to kind of blur together, right? And unless something really distinctive happens on the pardon my phone here, on the airplane. So that's really quite unusual. It involves strong affect. So what he's saying here is that because the memories are so upsetting, they are, in fact, resistant to retrieval through salient cues. Now the false memory explanation for this is that, well, gee, because stress hormones released at the time of the trauma strengthens memory for the central aspects of the experience. Reports of previously repressed memories are likely false, especially if they arise during so-called recovered memory therapy, where the therapist says your problems likely result from repressed memories, and to help you recover, we're going to find those memories and process them emotionally. Now, so these are quite different explanations. The third explanation, and I think this is the one that I think is probably the most likely. I mean, clearly there's certainly false memories of trauma. You know, we've studied people with a memory of people who thought they were kidnapped by space aliens, who honestly believe that they're not psychotic. So those are really wild explanations. But the third explanation here that we have for these, and it's not really a middle ground view. Occasionally you'll hear people say, well, it's true that some people repress memories of trauma and other people will have false memories of trauma. Maybe a sort of a middle ground review would say, well, sometimes you do repress them and sometimes you have false memories. It's not that. It's a quality explanation, I think, for the so-called recovered memory phenomenon. First of all, and this is based on our interviews with our subjects, the abuse was not traumatic in the sense of being terrifying when it occurred. This is a key point, because when we think about trauma, we're talking about these life-threatening experiences that the person encodes and consolidates and is intrusive and so forth. But our subjects, they weren't terrified at the time. Now, it's morally reprehensible, the abuse of these kids in these way, even with the fondling. That's not the issue. But it's not the sort of thing that triggers the massive release of stress hormones that would happen with say, a violent rape or a combat, what have you, that would really make the memory vividly and all too recallable. So that's one thing. So it wasn't traumatic when it occurred. When people remembered it later, and then said, oh my God, I can't believe my grandfather betrayed me in this way, that's a different story. Not necessarily understood as sexual or abusive. Our kids were quite young at the time, and they often didn't realize really what was going on. Where someone who's 11-year-old kid, it's a different story. And of course, in most of these cases, there are absent retrieval cues. This was something that's secretive that happened with them and the perpetrator. It may have only happened one or a few times, and then the perpetrator dies, the family moves to a new neighborhood, et cetera, and they just didn't have reminders around. And then, of course, there's often an encounter with potent retrieval cues. Some of our subjects would say they were reading an article in a magazine about incest, and they suddenly remembered something that happened in their own life. And the key thing that we found with our subjects, especially those that were most distressed by this, like I said, it was about a third of them actually qualified for post-traumatic stress disorder after remembering this, is that they had a retrospective reappraisal of the meaning of the experience. It was just a funny way that their uncle used to show his affection for you, and now it's realized that this was actually a sexual abuse. He was molesting and exploiting you. Very different type of appraisal. So hence we can have recovered memories of sexual abuse that were not previously repressed or dissociated, and that were not traumatic when they first occurred. So it's reprehensible, yes, but don't have the quality of the trauma where you get the rush of the stress hormones that help you that encode it very thoroughly. So people exposed to traumatic events are seldom, if ever, incapable of remembering them. People may not think about certain events for a long time, especially if the events were not experienced as traumatic at the time of their recurrence. But not thinking about something is not the same thing as being unable to remember it. Okay? And so with that, I think I'll close it and open it up for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you too. You covered so much so quickly. Yeah, it was incredible. Thank you very much. Actually, if you have questions, dinleyenler, sorularınız varsa verebilirsiniz. I am asking in Azerbaijani.
Of course.
If you can in English, it would be better. If not, I will continue to Feride Zeynalı. Feride, you can ask your question, please.
Hi, first of all, I'm sorry that I cannot open my camera now, but I appreciate your great presentation about this topic. My question is about actually cognitive rehabilitation. Do you suggest more concentrate on the side of psychological healing in a way, or do we also need to concentrate on cognitive rehabilitation, as memory is one of the more neuropsychological concepts that we must have some idea on? And also my second question would be, do we see some other impairments in other types of executive functions, like, inhibitory control, other executive functions domains, or is it just specific to kind of long-term memory functioning? Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I got all that. You were talking fast, and I wasn't sure if I caught all of that. I think one part of that was there any other evidence that people who've had these experiences actually have other impairments, such as difficulties in inhibitory cognitive control? Was that am I getting that right? We did not study that, actually, really. We studied some work on directed forgetting and other cognitive studies in the lab there, but not a general overall cognitive control. I don't know whether that's the case, unfortunately. The first question, if that might be rephrased, Gumru, did you catch that?
Dr. Faida, can you please try?
Yes, sir. I think I just lost my internet connection. So my first question was about cognitive rehabilitation aspect. So usually we usually cover it in the therapy sessions. However, should we refer our patients to cognitive rehabilitation to have to recover their memory or other executive function domains? Do you suggest that, or in your practice personally?
Yeah, no, I've not done that. No, that's interesting. The cognitive rehabilitation you see often with folks with after head injuries, right? Things like that, direct insults to the brain and the like. Certainly cognitive therapy, cognitive behavior therapy in particular, is a commonly used intervention for post-traumatic stress disorder. But here what they're trying to do is to have people interpret events in different ways and also then lose the intense emotional overreactions that they have to memories, right? And so it's really quite different from what applied cognitive neuropsychologists might do with people who are elderly or having problems with dementia. So it's not that type of, or have had a head injury. It's a very different type of cognitive intervention. Yeah, so it's really about changing the emotional valence of memories. That's really the focus, as opposed to improving someone's overall memory or attention or control. Good question.
Ask your question.
Hello. Hopefully you can hear me as I'm outside. Maybe the background noise might interrupt, but let me know if you can hear me right. So thank you very much, Richard, for your great and fast overview of what you are an expert. Now, I have a question regarding the sexual trauma, actually. So let's say that one goes to a therapy with X topic, X concern, and during the process, the sexual trauma comes up as they're trying to find out, as you mentioned, because when one is younger, they cannot see some actions as abusive. Right. And then later on in their lives, they kind of put the puzzles together and they understand it was not good. It was not appropriate. It was actually sexual abuse, which was done. And then what do you think as an expert? Should this be a focus during the therapy process? Or, I'm trying to understand, should this be a focus during the process? Or should the first initial request should be the process? What do you think? I hope I got my thoughts clearly out.
Yeah, I think I understand. You're coming through pretty clear. I hope I understood exactly what you're referring to. Yeah, so for example, in the process of therapy, somebody remembers, the therapy has certain reminders. And it just sort of comes into mind, oh my gosh, yeah, that certainly, could very well be a focus for the therapy. You may have sort of a detour in dealing with the meaning and any trauma-related symptoms, inability to sleep, etc., or more commonly, some of the cognitive distortions. So just to give you an example of this, one of my PhD students, Susan Clancy, who later wrote a book actually about subjects who had always remembered their childhood sexual abuse. So it wasn't about recovered memories or anything of that sort. But there was one theme that came through there that's highly relevant to the therapists, is that a lot of these now young adults who had these things, they were thinking, am I to blame for this? Did I somehow seduce my uncle, or did I do something? Am I partly at fault, etc.? And so, they're now maybe 25 years old, and they're looking back on themselves as 6 or 7 years old, and they are saying, am I sort of equally guilty to the assailant? And so the notion that little kids like that, they don't have the cognitive capacities really or the physical capacities to, push somebody away. And so the inappropriate shame and guilt that some of the survivors talked about, very, very important issue to address psychotherapeutically. That's apart from any trauma-related symptoms they might be having. But those things can be a big issue, where the therapist has got to make it clear that they're in no way partly guilty for the crimes that this person inflicted.
So do I understand correctly that if it gets starting to affect their daily life, right? Take the notes, then it's a place to focus on. Really. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So thank you very much. It was great.
Okay. Thank you.
Günel Muradova, you can ask your question.
Richard, thank you very much, and Gumru, thank you very much too for organization. It's. I have no question. I'm just thinking about that. Several years ago, the PTSD was like clear for us, but then we learned that we have complex PTSD.
Oh.
So the trauma phenomena now it's bigger, and as a psychotherapist and psychologist, sometimes it's difficult to work with complex PTSD because, for instance, if we are talking about the cognitive processing therapy, recent explosion therapy, we need just one clear memory to work. But when we are working with complex PTSD, we have several memories, and it's really difficult to manage the therapies. So I have no question. I wanted to hear your opinion about complex PTSD. I don't know about the DSM, but ICD-11 they put it as a disorder. So thank you very much.
Oh yeah! Wow, that brings back memories. Not repressed memories or traumatic ones. But I was on the DSM-4 core group. There's, I think, about 12 of us, 14 of us, who started working in the late 1980s, early 90s for DSM-4. Okay, and I was on the phobia committee and the PTSD committee. And the PTSD committee, we had other consultants. So you got a core group, but they were also meeting with other folks. And a colleague of mine in Harvard's Department of Psychiatry, I'm in psychology, but she was in psychiatry based at Cambridge Hospital, Judy Herman is her name. And Judy was making the case that we really need to have a disorder called complex PTSD. And she was the one who was really pushing that case. It was quite a new idea at the time, but her the claim, as you know, is that with repeated sorts of sexual abuse or physical abuse and neglect and things of that sort, especially with younger people, but not entirely. Some prisoners of war have shown that kind of a thing. That it does more than just cause PTSD symptoms. It's causing mistrust and the ability to build trusting relationships with other people and so forth. So it has a big interpersonal dimension as well. It's more complex. And her argument was that the evidence-based treatments for PTSD, and you mentioned a couple of them there, the cognitive processing therapy and exposure therapy, and like she said, those are for classic PTSD, single impact, or maybe a couple of them like that, but not the whole complex sort of a thing. And so she says we need to have this recognized as a formal disorder in the DSM-4. And Bessel van der Kolk Bessel was also kind of another voice, making the same claim. And three of us on the committee who happen to live in the Boston area, Cambridge, Boston, myself, Roger Pittman, psychiatry at Harvard, work mainly with war veterans, and Terence Keene at the Veterans Hospital in Boston. So Terry, me, and Roger met with them, and they were lobbying. They wanted us to come to the other members, the other 8 or 9 members of the committee, and say, look, these two, Bessel and Judy, really got a good point. We got to put this in here. And Judy's main argument was that complex PTSD can be missed, and you wouldn't necessarily see it, and we need to have treatments for that. And so then what happened? We brought this thing, and then they said, okay, we're going to have a field trial. So there was actually a whole field trial conducted by the DSM-4 committee, and what we found here was that almost everybody with complex PTSD also had regular PTSD, right? And so Judy's concerned that complex PTSD may present in such a way that they would be missed because there's no diagnosis for them, right? And in the DSM, that is. But that actually didn't happen because almost everybody who got a diagnosis of complex PTSD also had regular classic PTSD. So they weren't going to fall through gaps in the mental health system. So that was her major concern. She was worried about that. And the other thing is that she was talking about ways of researching how to treat them, but there wasn't any good clinical trials on that, and so it did not get included as a diagnosis in DSM-4. But of course, that does not prevent people from diagnosing it and treating it and doing research on it, which is exactly what people should be doing. But it was just so new, and this is in the early 1990s, around 91, 92, 93, that all these discussions were going on. And now you mentioned with ICD, it's showing up. Yeah, so it's making its way. But at the time that Judy and Bessel presented it, there was just hardly any work done on this. So, so that's and most of my involvement has not been with that, the C group. It's been the other. That's a long answer to a short question. Sorry.
Actually, I want to ask a question. In memory-focused trauma therapies, including EMDR and imagery-based interventions, how can a clinician distinguish a therapeutic modification of a memory from unintended memory distortions?
Wow. Yeah. Well, again, memory is not like a videotape machine, right? Like you're always going to have some type of distortion, so to speak. I mean, it's just the way the brain works. And so that's really a difficult thing. I mean, there's some people, some therapists, the French psychologist, Pierre Janet, for example, he talked about actually altering traumatic memories in various ways, and trying to change the memory to make it less traumatic. Janet said that it's hard to do. This is long before the exposure therapies, where I had no follow-up and they just keep going at our Patty Rees CPT. But yeah, I mean, it's... you mentioned EMDR. In what sense do you think EMDR distorts memories? Was that a question, or?
Yeah.
So a memory changes, right? So there's how does that differ from distortion? Distortion, if it in fact is a factually incorrect memory. So, for example, if I thought they were assaulted by two people and it was only one person, there's clearly a distortion. But a therapeutic change is likely going to be one of two things. One is that the meaning of the memory may differ, right? And so, like I was mentioning with the kids who'd been molested, who thought that they were somehow to blame for this, right? And so it was something that was a guilt-inducing kind of a thing. And so changing the appraisal or the meaning of that is relevant. Or another example is from war veterans, where just one memory here was an officer who had, this is Vietnam, he allowed some of his soldiers to go out and use a latrine, away from the base camp there, and there were Viet Cong there, and the guys killed them. And he felt he's guilty. If I hadn't have let those guys go, because there had been some firefights nearby, they would still be alive. But based on what he knew at the time, he gave them permission to venture out. The Viet Cong were not present. So that's based on the knowledge he has at the time. That was, fine. He shouldn't be condemning him. So the memory is there's changing the appraisal of it. Okay. And then, of course, is the main issue where the memory is less emotionally evocative. They can think about it without reliving it. Right. So those are the two ways that changing it therapeutically would be different from simply a distortion.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I have two more questions.
Okay.
You can ask your question.
Hi. First of all, I want to say thank you for this is great explanation.
You're welcome.
Organization to Gumru Hanım. Mr. Richard, I want to ask, mostly I'm working with teenagers, and when we have to face maybe sexual abuse, especially for our geography, what you can say?
Yeah, wow. Yeah, actually, you're just mentioning Muslims, and it reminds me, an old friend of mine, Metin Bajalu, who's in Istanbul. We've known each other for, 40 years or 50 years, 40 years, I think it is. Yeah, long time. Psychiatrist there. Works a lot with trauma. And I remember we had some meetings in Istanbul on different occasions, and there was one of the clinicians that was seeing rape victims who were coming over into Turkey, actually fleeing because they had been raped, but the family basically kicked them out of the family because somehow being the victim of a sexual assault was seen as shame on the family itself. It was a very unusual, at least to me, sort of reaction. But there were people coming over the border up into Turkey from Iraq, this is quite a while ago, who had these terrible experiences. And so there was that issue with the family. The example that you mentioned where family members said, oh, that can't be the truth. We did see those cases in our studies, not necessarily with the recovered memories, though, but with just the memories of sexual abuse that when they reported, say, oh, that's nonsense, you're just making that stuff up. So I've seen those kinds of cases as well, when they were obviously adults. In some of these cases, it may seem like that working with the whole family, as you suggested, would probably be advisable because these are special types of circumstances, I think, when the family doesn't believe them, or in the case of the people that Metin's group were seeing, that they were rejected. So I don't know if that gets at your question, but those are the things that come to mind prompted by what you asked.
that I mean that it will be helpful to work in.
I want to add something, Sevda. If there is something like rape or something else, you have to report this to family and to the government. You have to report about this.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you.
You're welcome. Farida, again, you can ask your question.
Yes, I have one more question. I'm sorry. You just mentioned about thank you very much. You just mentioned about war veterans, and that brought one more question to my head about moral injury. I wonder, what do you think about how it operates somehow differently in a concept that, like, moral injury, which is, you know, based on shame, guilt, compared with experiences based on fear, which are like two different emotions. So do you think that memory suppression somehow operates differently between these two concepts, or I wonder, what do you think?
Really good point. Really good point. One of my colleagues in Boston, Brett Litz, who's at the Boston VA Hospital for Veterans, he's done a lot of work in this. He originally started out with dealing with fear, and then he's working with the moral injuries, and really important because you'd see those a lot with the veterans, and I think that some of the people who there's one fellow's name slips me, who's at the University of Hawaii, but he was the therapy was much more cognitively oriented, really focusing on, because those are high level emotions, right? Guilt and shame, right? They're self-referential emotions, whereas fear is not. It's a very basic emotion. And so the sort of desensitization, the exposure therapy, the EMDR, all those sorts of things are really mainly dealing with really fear-based or anxiety-based, fear-based memories, not the high level emotions. So for example, I know that there were some people, I know these were veterans. I remember this goes back quite a few years. My psychiatry colleague, Roger Pittman, they were doing exposure therapies. But when it was the cases of what we would now call moral injury memories, they did not work. They didn't work. I mean, you're dealing with a more complex type of memory, dealing with the self-referential beliefs about how bad they are and and so you see people doing work where trying to do, you might say, restorative justice. Even if the person whom you wronged is no longer alive or things like that, you can still do things almost, I don't want to say symbolically because they're real things, to sort of restore your moral balance. So I know those are some of the things people have been trying to do with people traumatized by moral injury. But yeah, it's a great question. It's definitely a different thing than the fear-based.
Thank you very much, both Gumru and Richard. That was really amazing talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
May I add something to this point? My professor, Kay Chart, she's in America. She's working for Veterans of Affairs. And when I asked her about the EMDR, she said, no, we are not using EMDR. We are using just cognitive processing therapy and written exposure therapy. Because we need the memory-oriented, as you said, more cognitive-based therapies. So I was surprised, to be honest, because in Israel, they love EMDR, for instance.
And Metin Başoğlu hates it.
But I'm surprised that in America, and it is also, this has financial part as well, because the insurance cover cognitive processing therapy, written explosion therapy, not EMDR. So I was surprised, but then when I started working with veterans, I understand her points, because I'm also the CPT is my first line for war trauma, but not for complex PTSD, to be honest. Sometimes using mixed method.
Yes, right.
My professors, they hate this, the mixed methods. They're trying to put us use protocol, but but honestly, I'm using mixed.
Yeah, EMDR. Yeah, I have a history with Francine Shapiro and EMDR that goes back to the 1990s. Initially when it came out, she has a very close associate named Howard Lipke, a clinical psychologist at the North Chicago Veterans Hospital. And Francine had published her first case report, I think in 1989, in the Journal of Behavior Therapy and Experimental Psychiatry. It was edited by Joseph Wolpe at the time, the founder of Systematic Desensitization. He was also one of my clinical mentors, actually, a long time ago. And so I read the article. It's very interesting. The Francine used the EMDR, and I gave it to my colleague Howard Lipke, and the veterans liked it. They didn't like exposure therapy, but the more abbreviated version, and he became quite a big fan of EMDR. But then Francine was saying it was a treatment for all kinds of different things. And then I wrote an article on comparing the history of EMDR, which is fairly young history, to eye movement, or mesmerism, animal magnetism therapy. I don't know if you're familiar with this. It was Franz Anton Mesmer was an Austrian physician who went to Paris in the years prior, about 10 years before the revolution in France, and he was mesmerizing people. He was like a psychotherapist. It was a big, oh my God, it's a big controversy. But Francine thought I was defaming her by comparing her to the charlatan Mesmer. And oh my gosh, it was just I can send Gumru, I have her email, I can send you those articles about EMDR. But then later, what's that?
I can share with them.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and oh my gosh, yeah. So, but now there is actually some evidence that it may actually work. I had originally thought it was just primarily a sort of a version of exposure therapy, desensitization, right? With this unnecessary eye movements. But to Dutch Indenhout and Iris Engelhart, who I've known for a long time, they're good friends of mine, they had nothing to do, they're not making money off of EMDR or anything, but they actually did some research that suggested that the eye movements may actually be attenuating they're taxing working memory. And so when you think about a traumatic memory and you're doing a competing response at the time, it's hard to do both at the same time. And when you reconsolidate the memory and then remember it later, it's somewhat degraded. And so there might be something to the eye movements even, and so I'm happy to change my mind in response to the evidence. But yeah, Francine, she hated me. Oh God, she thought I was the devil after writing those articles about Mesmer and her. But yeah, that's a long time. God, that's 27 years ago. Holy smokes.
And Nuria, you can ask your question, please.
Thank you. Also, thank you to the Richard for sharing your experiences with us. I want to say that I'm new to this field and I don't have many experiences. In the future, I want to work with teenagers and adults. Do you have any recommendations? Like, what books would you recommend to us?
On post-traumatic stress disorder, or just general the therapies in general, evidence-based therapies?
General therapies.
Oh, okay. Yes, right. I think probably the best place to start actually is the title is, I believe, it's the Clinical Handbook of Psychological Disorders. I think that's the title, but the editor is David Barlow, Barlow, Dave Barlow. And there's been several editions of it. It's excellent. They have each chapter has got all sorts of clinical details and everything, and they also cover. It's a big book, as you might imagine. It's published by Guilford Press, I believe, is publishing that one as well. That they have in the past. It's an excellent. Dave Barlow is probably the greatest clinical psychologist in America. Certainly, he's now retired actually from Boston University, but he's a good friend of mine as well. So but I don't get a cut of the profit, so by recommending his books. But yeah, it's an excellent book, and so in fact, we use that in our graduate courses for our clinical PhD program because it's so good and it's very detailed, very clinically useful, and you also understand the evidence. It's mainly for adult disorders. But it covers most of them, including post-traumatic stress disorder. So I think if you're going to start any place entering the field, that Handbook of Clinical Psychological Disorders, David Barlow, that's the way to go.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. I'll send those two EMDR articles along. I think you'll find them.
Great. I can share. Great.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It was great. I think it was great for me. Okay.
That's a little heart's going up.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Okay, you're most welcome. Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Okay, good night, I should say, right?